Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim Wilson, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. It's quite a challenge to do so. Dan, my collaborator and friend, because I've only been given 300 words to do so, and I think I just used 30 of them. So I'll get right to it. Dan is one of the most accomplished psychological scientists alive today, having made seminal contributions to the areas of social perception, the nature of belief, affective forecasting, and recently the vicissitudes of conversation. He has the intellectual breadth of William James, the namesake of this award that he's about to receive, but also the ingenuity to bottle his insights into compelling experimental studies, as shown by the fact that he has published, by my count, 7 articles in Science alone and dozens more in other top journals. Now, Dan is also the consummate communicator of science. He has written a best-selling book, Stumbling on Happiness, written and hosted an award-winning PBS series, This Emotional Life, thrilled the millions of people who have seen his TED Talks, and has taught Introduction to Psychology to generations of enthralled Harvard undergraduates. Now, think how amazing it is for the same person to be one of the best psychological scientists in the world and also one of the best communicators in the world. It would be kind of like if Eric Clapton were also the New York Times music critic. Now, I use that analogy thoughtfully because it also so happens that Dan is an excellent guitarist and has published numerous articles in the New York Times. On a personal note, Dan has been a great friend and collaborator. One of my favorite things is to sit in his living room talking about ideas and experimental designs, especially when I know that in a few weeks or months, I'll get a paper in my inbox that Dan has written and put my name on. But seriously, the best thing that's happened in my career is getting to know Dan, having such a long friendship. I'm thrilled to be the one who gets to hand him this award, which is for a lifetime of significant intellectual contributions to the basic science of psychology. Dan.
Thanks, buddy. Thank you very much. About 30 years ago, I met Tim Wilson, and we liked each other and had similar ways of thinking, and so we decided we would do a study, and we enjoyed it, so we did another one, and it didn't occur to me at the time that I would never again do a study without him. And people sometimes ask me what the secret is of what must be among the most enduring partnerships in all of modern psychology, and the answer is simple. Whenever we're asked to introduce each other, we lie through our teeth. Now, everybody in the audience knows we're lying, but we don't care because it is a deeply bonding personal experience. We don't care if you think our love is wrong. I want to talk to you today about work that Tim and I have been doing over 3 decades. And I want to do that by introducing you to 4 animals, one of whom is named Ben, one of whom is named Tom, and 2 of whom are named Jerry. Now, these 4 animals have something important in common. Every one of them learns from experience. They learn by trial and error. Learning from experience is a remarkable ability, but it can be an expensive one. So if a cat chases a mouse, the mouse will learn to respond to the tinkling of the cat's bell, and it will run and hide before the cat even enters the room. We have Pavlov and Skinner to thank for our understanding of that. But this only happens if the mouse survives. And the fact that there are a whole lot of fat, happy cats in the world tell you that a whole lot of mice are not making it through the trial and error. The problem with trial and error is the error part, right? It's a problem because errors can be costly. In fact, they can even be fatal. That's why one of these Jerrys has, over an extraordinarily short amount of evolutionary time, developed the ability to do something that the other Jerry can't. Human Jerry can learn from experiences without actually having them. Ben and Jerry do not make this flavor of ice cream. I had to mock it up myself with Photoshop. Why don't they make it? Because they can simulate in their minds that liver and onion ice cream simply wouldn't taste good. They don't have to, if they were mice, they'd have to whip up a batch of the ice cream, rub their little whiskers in it, and go, well, that was a punishment. I won't do that silly thing again. But Ben and Jerry don't have to make the mistake in order to learn from it. This ability to think about what isn't, but what might be, is called prospection. And it is, I would argue, one of the keys to our species' dominion over this planet, right up there with language, fire, and opposable thumbs. Just as pilots use flight simulators to make sure that they practice and don't have to crash a real plane, human beings, in a sense, have a life simulator. And this life simulator allows them to audition their decisions and avoid crashing their actual lives. We can look into the future, figure out what's going to make us happy, how happy it's going to make us, how long that happiness will last. Now, without going blind, without getting fired, without having a child, without winning a lottery, everybody in this room knows which two of these are the good outcomes, which two of these are the bad outcomes, which of the two outcomes is better in each category. The only problem is that 30 years of research on affective forecasting suggests that you actually don't know what you think you know, because unlike a flight simulator, a life simulator fails. It fails reliably, routinely, and in a small number of ways that after 30 years we now understand pretty well. Here's what the research typically looks like that establishes this fact. It's not rocket science. You ask people to predict how they're going to feel if something happens, and then you either make it happen in an experiment or you wait for it to happen in the world, and then you ask them how they feel again. And if you subtract the two numbers and it's not zero, somebody's made a mistake. Let me give you an example. In one of our earliest studies, we asked assistant professors to predict how happy they would be in the years after their tenure decision. Everybody here knows that assistant professors come up for tenure after 6 or 7 years of service to their university, and if they get tenure, they get this hat, they get to wear it the rest of their lives, and they have a nice job. You also know that if they don't get tenure, they wear a different hat, they say cheese or no cheese with that for the rest of it. Of course they don't. They usually go on to have other academic positions, but they don't get to keep the job that they're essentially being fired from. So here's the question. What happens if you ask assistant professors to predict how happy they're going to be in the years after the tenure decision, if it goes well or if it goes badly? Well, assistant professors tell you just what you would expect them to tell you. They tell you that over the course of these years, they'll be much happier if they're allowed to keep their jobs than if they get fired from them. But when you actually go and measure the happiness of associate and full professors and people with other jobs who have been through the tenure process and come out on either side of it, what you find is no statistically reliable difference. And I'm not saying that in the first 30 minutes it's just as good to get the call yes as the call no. Of course not. What I am saying is that in the 5 years afterwards, that decision doesn't continue to make the difference that assistant professors think it will. Now, in case you think this only happens because academics are unusually gullible people, I can tell you decades of research shows that it happens in experiments and in the world in many different situations. This is true of people falling in love and falling out of love. This is true of people getting jobs and losing jobs. This is true of people winning elections and losing elections. In every case, case after case, people overestimate the impact that these events will have on their lives. The interesting question isn't whether this happens. The interesting question is why. And what we've discovered is that there are four reasons why people make the kind of mistake I've shown you here today. One of them is the one I'll talk about, and it's called presentism. I want to show you that this particular error creates problems in our decisions and in our judgments. Now, presentism is a term that historians coined in the early part of the 20th century to describe a mistake that they think historians can make, which is the tendency to judge the behavior of people in the past by present standards. So in the 17th century, people set cats on fire for entertainment, and that horrifies most of us, but historians caution that we ought to interpret that behavior by the moral standards of that day and not by our own, and if you don't, you're guilty of presentism. Well, it turns out that this error that bedevils historians also plagues us. When we look backwards, we have the same effects as when we look forwards. Prospection is as susceptible to presentism as retrospection is. Here's an example. I love science fiction art. These are pictures of the year 2000. Now, you might not have guessed it was the year 2000, but if I asked you when were these pictures drawn, virtually all of you would correctly say the 1950s. How did you know that? Because these pictures, like almost all of science fiction art, look much more like the times in which they were drawn than the times that they're meant to portray. The way the people are dressed, the architecture, the things that they're doing. All of these look like 1958 because when an artist in 1958 tried to imagine the future, he or she made a mistake. Mistakenly thinking what? That the future would look a whole lot like the present. I want to suggest to you that what happens to artists when they try to imagine the future is exactly what happens to all of us when we try to imagine the future. When we try to imagine our own futures, we overweight the present. Because like artists, we are prisoners of now. When we try to view our futures, we always see it through the lens of the present. Here's an example. You know that there are two ways to shop when you go to the grocery store, and if you're smart, you've chosen one of them. You've chosen this way. You go there with a list and you buy what you see on the list. But a whole lot of times you end up in the grocery store without a list, and how do you have to shop? You have to shop by going up and down the aisles and asking yourself, will I want to eat this in the future? When people try to imagine what they're going to want to eat in the future, are those decisions influenced by how they feel in the present? To find out, we ran a very simple experiment. We got in cahoots with a grocery store, and as shoppers were entering the grocery store, we stopped them and asked if they had a list. A large proportion of them said no. If they said yes, they couldn't be in our study, but if they said no, they could be. We then took people who didn't have lists and we asked them to make one. What are the things they had come for? Then half of them were randomly assigned to eat a very large cinnamon roll, about 800 calories worth of sugar in a big burst, and those of you, even without a course in physiology, you know that very quickly reduces what? Your momentary hunger. All of them then go into the store and they shop, and then we analyze their grocery receipts, and we look to see what they bought that they didn't actually come for. You might not be surprised to see that when people go into the grocery store without the list that they made for us, they buy a whole lot more unplanned food when they're hungry than if they've just eaten a cinnamon roll. Remember, these people are not there shopping for something to eat now. They're shopping for the week, but they're buying a lot more stuff when they're hungry today than when they're not. Well, maybe hungry people just buy more stuff. Nope, not when they have a list. When they don't have to mentally voyage into their own futures, when they just have to buy things that are written down, their current hunger has no effect on their purchasing decisions. Now, this sort of presentism isn't limited to our attempts to predict what we're going to want to eat. It even affects our attempts to predict who we will want to be. This is a picture of me when I was 16 years old. Hair today, gone tomorrow. Whenever I show this, I see young men doing this. It's like, really? Yeah, I wasn't born this way, guys. But okay, the reason I'm showing you this is I'm pretty sure that when I had this hairdo, I thought I would always want to have this hairdo. In fact, let my freak flag fly longer, down to here, down to there. I was quite sure that that's how I'd want to look my entire life because I couldn't imagine being a person who didn't want to look that way. What does this show? It shows that teenagers are stupid. Right? Teenagers are so stupid that they think they will always be tomorrow who they are today. Well, we actually now have some good scientific evidence that teenagers are stupid. If you ask 28-year-olds how much they've changed in the last 10 years, and then ask 18-year-olds to predict how much they will change in the next 10 years, you don't get the same numbers. 28-year-olds tell you, wow, this has been a decade of change. And teenagers, 18-year-olds, say, yeah, I don't think I'm going to change all that much from who I currently am. Teenagers are stupid. But it turns out that everybody is stupid, because when you look across the lifespan, you see exactly the same effect when people are 68 versus 58. Now, these lines are going down, meaning that people realize that you change less as you age. They predict that will happen. They report that will happen. But the direction of the lines isn't what's important. It's the constant separation between them. 68-year-olds are going, wow, 58 to 68 is a decade of change. And 58-year-olds are going, I am baked. I'm fully done. It's just a few more wrinkles and a little more fat from here, but I am who I am. We all underestimate how different we will be in the future. Now, in this case, this kind of presentism can actually bedevil our decision making, not just our predictions. So, for example, in one study, we asked people how much they would pay for 2 different concerts. One of the concerts we asked them about was how much they would pay for a concert that wasn't going to take place for 10 years, but that was going to feature the person who was currently their favorite singer. We also asked people, and they told us on average about $129 for that ticket. We also asked people how much they would pay to see a concert today for the person who was their favorite singer 10 years ago. The answer to that question was 80, almost half the amount. Now, you don't have to be an economist or do a whole lot of math to look at these numbers and say they ought to be the same because they're the same concert. You're just asking the person when it is their favorite singer or after that moment has passed. 80 is the right answer. 129 is the wrong answer. 129 is deeply overestimating how much you will still like Taylor Swift 10 years from now. Just as it is very hard to imagine not feeling tomorrow like we feel today, not being tomorrow who we are today, it's really hard to imagine not thinking tomorrow what we're thinking today. When something is in our minds, it's very hard to imagine what it would be like when it's not in our minds. And so when we predict what we're going to want in the future, we often act as though in the future we will be thinking what we are thinking now when we're thinking about the future. I know that's a little hard to get your head around, but I'll unwind it for you. Many of you know this wonderful old experiment by Tversky and Griffin, 1991, where students are asked about 2 hypothetical jobs. At one of the jobs they're told you'll earn $100,000. I've beefed up the numbers for today's salaries. $100,000 a year. At the other job, you'll only earn $90,000 a year. It's for exactly the same work. Which of these 2 will make you happier? That's a 1-item IQ test. Obviously, job 1. Oh, but wait a minute, Tversky and Griffin say. At job number 1, other people who are doing exactly what you do will earn $10,000 more than you, whereas at job number 2, people doing exactly what you will do will earn $10,000 less. Which of these 2 jobs will make you happier? By a whopping margin, people say job number 2, a job at which I will personally bring in 10% less income for me and my family, but damn it, I'll be making more than the guy in the other cubicle. People believe the comparison between their salary and the other person's salary is so powerful that it's going to actually make them less happy to have more money. Now here's the question. Tversky and Griffin couldn't answer, of course. Were they right? Well, yes, they're right if the thought they're having as they look at these 2 jobs is the thought they'll be having the rest of their lives. If they take job number 1 and walk around all day going, I make 100, he makes 110, I make 100, he makes 110, I make 100, he makes 110, then yes, that's a terrible job for you. You're going to be miserable. But the question is, will you always be thinking that same thought that you're thinking now as you look at the slide? In fact, research suggests that when people are comparing things in the present, although they act as though they'll still be comparing them in the future, they often won't. This is established in one of my favorite experiments done with Carrie Morwedge and I did this experiment, which means Carrie did this experiment. This is the simplest experiment that Harvard students have ever been paid $7 to take part in. They come into the laboratory and they're sat down in front of a bag of Lay's potato chips. And they are asked to predict how much they will enjoy eating one. Then they eat one. People, it's actually people in a different experiment, are then asked to report how much they actually enjoyed eating the chips. Got this? How much will you like them? Crunch, crunch, crunch. How much did you like them? That's it. That's the whole experiment. But what the subjects in this participants, sorry, they've been promoted. What the participants in this experiment don't know is that we're conducting it in two different rooms. One of the rooms is what we might call the chocolate room. In the chocolate room, the potato chips are sitting right in front of them, but there in the corner of this messy lab room is a whole bunch of chocolate. And in case you don't know, basically undergraduates think chocolate is better than all other known foods. So these people are looking at potato chips, and the whole experiment is about potato chips, but within their eyesight is something much better. People in this study are in what we might call the spam room. There in the corner are a variety of tinned meats. There's Spam, there's sardines, there's canned haggis. You can buy sheep intestine in a can, but a number of lovely delicacies that are also off in the corner have nothing to do with today's experiment. Now, do these items that are in the corner of the room influence their predictions about how much they'll like potato chips and their experiences of how much they like potato chips? The answers are yes and no. It affects their predictions dramatically. If you're sitting in the Spam room and someone asks you how much you're going to like potato chips, you go, wow, they're going to be great. But in the chocolate room, you say, I think they'll be so-so. What's interesting is just seconds later, you put the chips in your mouth and what happens? Nothing. Why? Because when your mouth is filled with crackly, crunchy, salty, greasy, fried potato flavor, it is what it is, and most people like it. They're not crunching and going, this tastes extraordinarily non-spammy. Just nothing haggis-like about it. No, once you're having the experience, the comparison you were making just moments before utterly vanishes. The fact is that we live with our choices, not with our non-choices. Non-choices become rapidly irrelevant, fading memories that don't influence the experiences we're having. Sure, they come to mind once in a while. We all experience a little regret or relief about the past. But the fact is, you think much more about the person you do marry than the person you don't marry. Some of you are too young to know what this still is from, and I can only say it is a great deficit in your life. Most old movies just are really bad if you see them again now. This one is a classic. This, of course, is one of the final scenes from Casablanca. Background, Casablanca, Humphrey Bogart is Sam, Ingrid Bergman is Ilsa. Ingrid Bergman is married to Victor. Victor is going to go destroy the Nazis, but she has fallen in love with Sam, and they are standing on the tarmac while her husband's on the plane, and she has a decision to make. Do I go with Victor, my husband, and kill all the Nazis, or do I stay here with the man I have fallen in love with? And what Bogart says to her in these immortal words is, we both know you belong with Victor. If that plane leaves the ground and you're not with him, you'll regret it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, and for the rest of your life. That is beautiful screenwriting. That is bad psychology. Ilsa, by the way, gets on the plane with her husband. Wrong decision, Ilsa. Stay with Bogart. You will forget about Victor sooner than you think, because life is a bowl of potato chips, and the things we don't do and that we don't choose stop affecting us much more quickly than we realize. Now, I want to show you another way in which presentism can cause us to make bad decisions by sharing with you some very recent research on a phenomenon that we've been investigating called the allocator's illusion. This is a Cloritarian. I don't know how many of you have ever seen this, but this is the world's oldest vending machine. And what it dispensed was fairness. In the 4th century BC, Athenian citizens, and that meant Athenian men, not women, not slaves, inserted one of these little wooden tokens called a pinakia into the machine, and it caused dice to come rolling out. And how the dice rolled determined whether that citizen could sit on a jury or serve in the legislature. The Greeks invented democracy, and they designed this device because they believed who had power was much less important than the fairness of the procedure that had empowered him. Fairness mattered. And 25 centuries later, I hardly need to tell you, human beings are deeply concerned with the fairness of the procedures that are used to allocate resources. Now, the procedures vary across domains, don't they? We award annual bonuses by productivity. We make committee assignments by seniority. Food stamps are by necessity. Lottery prizes are by chance. But in every one of these cases, the fairness of the allocation procedure matters a lot to those who are affected by it. This is painfully obvious to everyone, and everybody here knows it's true, which means I've got a hard job to do, which is to convince you that actually fairness matters a whole lot less than we think it does. Specifically, I want to convince you that those who allocate resources vastly overestimate how much the fairness of the allocation procedure will affect the happiness of those who receive those resources. First, let me show you this is true. Second, let me show you why it's true. And third, let me try to show you what its consequences are. Consider this very simple study. We bring 3 subjects into a laboratory. We designate one of them the allocator and 2 of them the receivers. The allocator is given a $10 bill and told to allocate it to one of the 2 receivers. You can't rip a $10 bill in half. Somebody goes away from the experiment with $10 more, and somebody goes away with nothing. Now, the allocators are told they can have to give the money to just one of the 2 receivers, and the way they decide which receiver is one of 2 procedures. One of them is a canonically fair procedure for allocating resources, the coin flip. The other one is a potentially unfair procedure, which is they just pick. They just pick which of the receivers is going to get the $10 and which is going to get nothing. Now, we ask allocators to make predictions. First of all, specifically, we ask them, predict for us how happy each receiver will be if they get the money or don't get the money by the fair or the unfair procedure. Then, we randomly assign the allocators to use one of these procedures. They don't choose which procedure they want to use. Why? They'd all pick the fair one. There's no benefit to them for picking the potentially unfair one, but we randomly assign them to use one of these 2 procedures, and then we allocate the money as they have decided or as the coins decided, and then we measure the happiness of each of the receivers. Now, let's start by looking at what the allocators thought was going to happen. Allocators tell us, this is just the unfair condition. Allocators tell us if I select a guy to get $10 and another guy to get $0, the guy who gets the $10 is going to be really happy, and the guy who doesn't will be really unhappy. Let's call this difference between the winner and the loser in every condition the happiness gap. Now, allocators also tell us that the winner will be happier than the loser if the money is allocated fairly, but that gap will shrink. The difference, and I'm saying this slowly because this is a pattern of data I want to show you a few times, the difference in the size of these 2 gaps is a measure of how much allocators think fairness matters. Because it's the same amount of money in the 2 conditions, it's just a different procedure for allocating. And allocators are saying there will always be a gap between winners and losers, but that gap is smaller when the allocation was done fairly. Are they right? No, they're not right. Absolutely not right. It makes no difference whatsoever to receivers in this study how the money was allocated. What matters is, did I get it or not? If I got it, good. If I didn't, bad. How did it come to me? Who cares? Now, why does this happen? Let me first show you the easy way to visualize this. You take these gaps and compare them in size, and you can see that the difference in the gaps is very large for allocators' predictions, but very small for receivers. Now, the question is, why does this happen? It happens because allocators are typically in the business of choosing between procedures that differ in their fairness. They're deciding whether employees should be promoted by seniority or productivity. They're deciding whether college students should be admitted by SAT or also by race. They're deciding whether airline passengers should board by row number, board by seat number, or board by status. They have to make a decision about which procedures to use to allocate resources. And as a result, they are thinking and comparing a wide range of different procedures. And so the differences between the procedures loom extremely large to the allocator. What the allocator doesn't seem to realize is that in the future, Once the allocation has been made, once one of these procedures has been enacted, the people on the other side of the allocation will be mainly thinking about what they got, not about what they didn't get. Just like people who are eating potato chips are thinking about what is in their mouth and not what might have been in their mouth, receivers are mainly thinking about what's in their pocket and not what might have been in their pocket. Now, if this is true, then there's an interesting prediction. If it is true, it should be the case that if we simply could reverse the temporal positions of allocators and receivers, we should be able to completely reverse our effect. What do I mean by reverse the temporal positions? In the studies I showed you, and in other studies that I have spared you, we measure the allocator's predictions before the allocation is made, and we measured receivers' reactions after the allocation was made. That's natural. What would happen if we reversed the measurement of these two things? What if we were to ask allocators after the allocation was made to guess how happy the receivers now are? And what would happen if we asked receivers before the allocation was made to guess how happy they'll be after it's made? Well, what you end up with is a reversal of the phenomenon. What you see here, look at the happiness gap in each condition, I'll show it to you there, is that when allocators are estimating how happy receivers are after the allocation is made, they suddenly look like the receivers you already saw. They say, yeah, the fairness doesn't matter. What really matters is how much money they got. Receivers, the people in whose pockets the money will land, before the allocation is made, they say, oh boy, it's going to be a whole lot better if it's fair than unfair. What this study suggests is that it's not the role allocators and receivers are playing that determine the differences in their judgment. It's the temporal perspectives they have. Everybody who makes a prediction before the allocation is chosen suffers from presentism and the allocator's illusion. Okay, so what? Why does it matter if these two people disagree about the effects of the allocation procedure? Here's why. In the real world, if allocators just had to choose between fair and unfair procedures, they would always pick fair ones because it's all benefit and no cost. The problem is that in the real world, there is what economists call a fairness-efficiency trade-off. Many, many times, the thing that is most efficient is not the thing that is most fair. What do I mean by efficient? Economists define efficiency, economic efficiency is essentially when resources are allocated in a way such that no receiver can be made better off without making another receiver worse off. Some of you know this as Pareto optimality. And the idea basically is it's the most efficient distribution of resources. The resources have been used as well as they can to create as much utility or happiness as possible. But allocators often have to trade off fairness and efficiency. For example, we know that the most efficient way to allocate organs for transplant isn't the way that most people think is fair, because it actually penalizes you for being old, and we just don't think you ought to. Thank God, we don't think you should be penalized for being old. And as a result, in our country, we allocate organs inefficiently in order to indulge our feelings about fairness. We know that, for example, standing in a line, the best way to allocate resources for people standing in a line is not to give the first person who lines up the resources that they came for. It turns out there are other procedures that distribute the resources more optimally. But damn to hell, the efficiency, we care about fairness. So we're constantly trading fairness against efficiency. You already know this if you have ever had 3 pieces of candy and 2 children. You know what you should do. Burn the resource. Just throw the 3rd piece of candy away, right? If you give each of them a piece of candy, they are happy. If you give one of them 2 pieces of candy, now the one who got 2 is happy, but the one who only got 1 is absolutely furious. We know from very good research now that people will actually destroy resources, that is, lower the efficiency of an allocation in order to maximize fairness. But is that wise? Well, it is if the receivers are going to care as much about fairness as you think they are, and as you're starting to guess, I don't think they normally do. We modeled this dilemma. I'm going to show you just one more experiment. We modeled this dilemma in an experiment in which we had allocators allocate either a small amount of money or a large amount of money, and they did it either fairly or unfairly. Using the paradigms that you've just seen, they allocate the small or the large pot to a winner and a loser, and it's done with a fair or an unfair procedure, and then we measure how happy receivers are at the end. Now, I want to show you data that look different than the data I've shown you, because what you're seeing here, these bronze bars, are the combined happiness of the winners and the losers. This is just how much happiness in the world did your allocation create. And what you can see is that, what you can see is that allocators think they will create more happiness in the world by allocating a small amount fairly than a large amount unfairly. But in fact, they create more happiness by allocating a large amount unfairly than a small amount fairly. How do these data come to be? Well, look at what the winners and the losers have to say. First, take a look on the left side only at the allocators' predictions. What are allocators telling us there? They're saying, a guy who gets a large amount of money will be happier than a guy who gets a small amount of money. The guy who gets nothing will be really pissed if it was unfair, but he'll be accepting if it's fair. You've seen this pattern before. That's in every experiment I've shown you. But what really happens? What really happens is it is true that a man who takes away more money is happier than a man who takes away less. What isn't true is that a guy who gets nothing cares why. He got nothing and he doesn't care why. He's not particularly happy. Allocators think that the loss in happiness by you allocating a small pot that accrues to the winner will be offset by the gain in happiness from the loser. You know that giving that child the extra piece of candy will make him happier, but you fear that it will be offset by the fury of the child who didn't get enough. What these data suggest is that simply isn't true. This suggests that destroying resources to increase happiness can at least sometimes be a big policy mistake. And it's exactly the kind of policy mistake we make because of the allocator's illusion, which is caused by presentism. Now, what does this all mean? This is what many of the people listening to this talk will take away. Gilbert said that contrary to what the Greeks told us and what philosophers have been claiming ever since, people don't really give a damn about fairness. This isn't what I said. What I actually said was that however much a receiver cares about fairness in a particular instance, and in the studies I showed you it was very little, but in many other studies we've done, it's a lot. However much it is, the allocator's temporal position is likely to lead him or her to overestimate the magnitude of that concern, and therefore to sacrifice things that the receiver might actually care about even more. In everyday life, we have to constantly decide how to allocate things of value to people who value many things, including what they got and how they got it. To do this properly, we have to be able to look forward in time and try to imagine what the world will look like to people who are looking backwards in time. Presentism is what makes this a cognitive challenge to which, obviously, allocators do not always rise. About 2 million years ago, the human brain began a remarkable transformation, nearly tripling in size in what is really a very short amount of evolutionary time. Some of the structures of the brain stayed pretty much the way they were, and others changed dramatically. We now know that one of the primary functions of the hugely enhanced structures is to support a neural network that allows human beings to do what no other animal on our planet can do: close their eyes and mentally travel through time, flexibly, easily, and often. Whenever you want to, you can just take a journey to Elsewhere, can't you? Imagining any world that hasn't yet come to pass, but that might. This is a remarkable ability, a truly remarkable ability, but because it's new, it's still kind of in beta testing, at least from evolution's point of view. Prospection is a remarkable ability that is only now being tested on the market, and as a result, it's got bugs, it's got glitches, it has errors, it causes problems. And what I've tried to show you today is that the most basic problem that it causes is presentism. This mental time machine of ours never really achieves escape velocity. It takes us away from the present, but not as far away from the present as we tend to think. I have spent much of my life trying to understand how the mind journeys through time, and a Lifetime Achievement Award is a very salient reminder that I have been on that journey for quite some time, and that my last hills are within sight. And I just want to say what a gift it has been to be on that journey with all of you, my fellow psychologists. And I thank you for this award and for the honor of having spent this lifetime in your company. Thank you.